Hi, my name is Mikkel Adgate. I am a director in the Bureau of Public Affairs at the Department of Environmental Protection. Just want to take a moment to thank you all for coming out to our annual Citywide LTCP meeting. This is a really great opportunity for us to communicate all the things that have been happening in our CSO program and our Green Infrastructure Program. We have a lot of material to get through tonight, but also a lot of opportunity to dialogue with all of you. So just to go through the agenda and sort of give a meeting overview, we're joined by our Commissioner, Vinny Sapienza, who's going to talk us through sort of DEP in general and our wastewater system. We have our Deputy Commissioner for Sustainability, Angela Licata, who will be talking about green infrastructure and integrated watershed management. And then we'll take a pause there to do a few questions related to green infrastructure and her material. Then we're joined by Acting Deputy Commissioner of our Bureau of Engineering, Design, and Construction, Jim Muller, who will be talking us through our Green Infrastructure Program. And then Angela is going to pop back up to talk a little bit about affordability and to give the context of the whole CSO program. And then we have a panel of DEP senior staff who will be doing questions. We'll have about an hour for pop-up questions. But all of you also have note cards at your seats. So if for some reason you're unable to ask your question during that time, you can feel free to write your question down, submit it to us at the entrance table where you came in, and we'll include that in our formal response to comments of tonight's meeting. So you'll have an opportunity to both ask your questions live to the panel, but also write them down. And then lastly, we'll be joined by our Deputy Commissioner for the Bureau of Public Affairs, who will talk about our public participation process before we close out. So I just want to thank all of our bureaus, sustainability, BEDC, wastewater treatment. They worked really hard to put together a program that we hope is engaging and gives a lot of opportunity for us to talk about all of the success of our program and all the work that's been done to improve water quality in the city. So with that, I'd like to turn it over to our Commissioner, Vinny Sapienza.
Thanks, Mikkel. Good evening, everyone, and again, thanks for being here today. And as Mikkel said, it's a great opportunity for the team at DEP, and you've got a lot of the senior leadership here at the table to explain some of the things that we've been looking at and doing, and getting your feedback to see if you guys think we're headed in the right directions, or changes you might want to see that we can incorporate into the program. So again, thank you all for being here. And just before I start, a couple of more thank yous. Help putting this together, Amy Boulay, Don Walker, and Peter Young, who are here. From Councilman Costa Constantinides' office, he's the environmental chair of the City Council. Nick Wazowski is here, so thank you, folks from DEC. And of course, none of this could have got done without Mikkel Adgate, so thank you, Mikkel. So I am just going to quickly go through what DEP does, and a little bit of a background on what CSOs are for those of you who aren't familiar with them yet. So New York City DEP, we are the water and sewer utility for New York City. We provide about 1 billion gallons a day of clean drinking water to half of New York State's population. It comes from a 2,000 square mile watershed in upstate New York. 2,000 square miles is about 6 times the size of New York City itself. So it's a big territory that we protect to make sure we have some of the best drinking water in the world. We actually, where my pin, this past year celebrated the 175th anniversary of bringing water from the Croton Reservoir system into New York City. So it's a big system, and it's been around for a long time. On the wastewater treatment side, we treat 1.3 billion gallons a day of wastewater at 14 wastewater treatment plants, and those plants were built out over about a 50-year period from the 1930s through the 1970s, or 1980s rather. And at that time, all dry weather discharges stopped, and we've started working more on wet weather. And then last bullet is we, DEP, are the city agency that's responsible for enforcing the air, noise, and hazardous materials codes for the city. Capital plan, just to quickly go through, Mayor de Blasio announced the largest capital plan for DEP this past April, $18.1 billion. It's $3 billion more than our previous 10-year capital plan that was announced a couple of years ago. And just to quickly go through where we spend our money. So sewer construction and water mains, I talked about the thousands of miles of sewers and water mains that we have, some of which date back to the 1800s. We want to make sure in New York City that we're investing money to keep those assets in good repair and replace them as necessary. And so we've got in our budget $2 billion on new water main construction, $4 billion on sewers, and sewers not only replacing old sewers or undersized sewers, but some areas of the city still do not have storm sewers that are adequate to prevent flooding, like in Southeast Queens. And our budget's got $1.7 billion to relieve that underserved community. State of good repair, I mentioned we've got 14 wastewater treatment plants. We want to make sure that they're all well operated and maintained and can continue to meet all federal and state standards. That takes a lot of money to do, and we've got $5.7 billion in our 10-year capital plan to maintain those. This thing called dependability, $2 billion, that's the dependability of our water supply. So we've got a lot of funding there to make sure that our dams and dikes and reservoirs are in a state of good repair, all the mechanical systems, our aqueducts, our tunnels, and this also includes the completion of City Water Tunnel number 3 in Brooklyn and Queens. And then finally, about 20% of our budget we've got for mandates, federal and state mandates, things that we're required to do to meet the Safe Drinking Water Act, the Clean Water Act, and that's going to be really the focus of stuff we're talking about today. A lot of people say, well, $18.1 billion, can't you do better? We're a wealthy city. And we always remind folks that water and sewer infrastructure is paid under state law through water bills that everybody pays, whether you're a homeowner, property owner, or a renter. You ultimately are going to pay for water. And what we like to remind people is that New York City may be a rich city, but 21% of the city's population is at or below the poverty level, and it's tough. We know that about the lower bottom quartile of households have an income that requires them to pay 4.5% or more of their income towards water and wastewater services. So we're very sensitive about how fast we spend money to improve and upgrade the water and sewer systems, and so we always keep that in mind. So what is a CSO? And that's why we're here today. So I think it's pretty simple, and the first thing I want to just say is we all think CSOs are bad. It's a release of raw wastewater into local receiving waters, and our goal is to ultimately reduce them to the maximum extent that we can. So I'll talk about what it is. So unlike like most municipalities that are older around the country, there's one sewer pipe beneath each street, and that pipe accepts wastewater, sanitary sewage from houses and commercial facilities, and stormwater runoff that hits the street and goes into a catch basin. It all goes into one pipe. So on a dry weather day, when there's no rain, it's only sewage from buildings that goes into this pipe, runs down, drops in here, and goes all to a wastewater treatment plant, and it's treated, completely treated. So today it didn't rain. Every drop of sewage in the city went to a wastewater treatment plant, got treated. On a wet weather day, however, about 10 times the amount of water can get into the sewer systems compared to a dry weather day. And the way the sewer system was built was most of that water makes its way to a wastewater treatment plant. We treat per year about 470 billion gallons of water. But on wet weather days, there can be some releases, and per year we release about 20 billion gallons of that water. So we treat 470 billion, release about 20, and the program, the long-term programs that we have in place going forward that we're here to talk about today is to address those overflows. So this is just one other thing I wanted to point out. We in New York City, and this goes back to, I guess, 1980s when I and some of my colleagues started, we're actually releasing 110 billion gallons a year of raw overflows into New York City waterways from CSOs. We've done a lot, spent a lot of money, that's the green line, and we're down, as I said before, to about 20 billion gallons a day. So made a lot of progress, spent a lot of money, and so this is what we've got left and what we're trying to push down a little bit further. And because of those investments, just want to point out, these are two graphics we put in our annual harbor water quality report. 1985, many of the waterways in New York City had very high fecal coliform bacteria counts. Some people called the Hudson River an open sewer back then. But because of all the investments that have been made over the time, we've done a lot better, and most of the harbor is now less than 100 fecal counts. It's swimmable water. But we do, it's tough to see in the graphic, but there are places like Flushing Bay, Flushing Creek, Coney Island Creek, some of the tributaries in the Bronx that still do not meet those standards, and you can see little bits of green and little bits of yellow in there. And so the focus of our long-term control plans is to address those tributary water bodies and try to improve those. So I am done, and I'm going to now turn it over to our Deputy Commissioner for Sustainability, Angela Licata, who's going to talk about our Green Infrastructure Program, which is a key component of our long-term control plans.
Thank you, Commissioner. Good evening, everyone. It's really nice to see so many familiar faces and those faces of people that have been very devoted to these issues. It's also really nice to see some new faces. So I will start a conversation really trying to give you a status and an update on where we are with the New York City's Green Infrastructure Program, and to really identify that in order for us to be successful with our Green Infrastructure Program, we're going to have to concentrate on three different areas. One is the right-of-way, which is where we have launched our program, and that is because the right-of-way is approximately 27% of the impervious surfaces in the city of New York. All of those roadways and sidewalks and hardscapes that you see are what we consider the right-of-way. Then we also want to concentrate on public properties. That's a great opportunity for us. And also, in order to be successful, we will have to manage stormwater that falls on private properties. So we want to talk a little bit about an initiative we have there, because unless we handle stormwater on all three of those locations, we will not be able to achieve our goals and meet the milestones that we have committed to under a consent order. So what this shows, we're going to start now with how we're scaling up green infrastructure in New York City on the right-of-way. These are just a snapshot of projects. Each dot is an asset of a green infrastructure project, and the blue dots are the ones that are in final design phase. The yellow dots are in construction, and the green dots are all the ones that we have constructed. So we started in the right-of-way. It was a great opportunity. It provided low-hanging fruit for us because we can control that, partnering with other city agencies. And that's how we began to initiate really the capital investments to date of over $410 million. And in the 10-year plan that the Commissioner mentioned, we have an additional $1 billion dedicated to green infrastructure. And that's for the entire program, not just the right-of-way. So together, we have now installed over 4,000 of these GI assets. The majority of these are what we call rain gardens. Has anybody seen these rain gardens out on the streets? I just kind of curious as to how many people are aware what they are. Okay, we'll have a picture of them in a moment here. So this right-of-way program status, just a blowout now so you can see the entire city. The dark blue is all that have been constructed. The medium blue is really what's in design, and the lighter blue is the earlier design. And what happens here with this program is that we look for 100% of the opportunities. So if we go into a watershed or a sewer shed, as we call them, or an area that's tributary to one of these outfalls that we call a combined sewer overflow outfall, what we do is we walk the streets and we look for every opportunity on that sidewalk that doesn't currently have something else which is preventing a rain garden, such as bus stops and driveways and all these other things that could really interfere with our opportunities to install green infrastructure. Once that's done, then we look at the geotech. So we look at the ability of the underlying soils to really infiltrate the stormwater into the ground. So that's really the next phase in this. And within each of these areas, particularly within Newtown Creek, where we have had some design contracts where we had sought to increase enough scope, we have also looked at every opportunity for schools and public housing sites, and also for parkland. So we've really begun that process on the second bucket that I mentioned to you that we need for green infrastructure. We are currently, DEP is currently maintaining all of the green infrastructure assets, and we have 50 plus green jobs at the moment. We had about 30 or 25 in 2016, and we're bringing on another 30 for 2017. So we're really looking to augment not only the litter removal that we're doing on those assets that we've accepted after they've been constructed, but also during the period of establishment when the contractor is still installing some of the elements, and in part of that guarantee period with our contractors, we're also going to be supplementing the litter removal and other necessary work associated with maintaining these rain gardens. We now are into the second bucket, which is our public agency partners. So we're looking for every opportunity to partner with these agencies that are listed on the slide, namely the Parks and Department of Education and the Housing Authority. But we also have some initiatives with some of the fire departments and some libraries in Brooklyn and Queens. And we seek to increase the partner list as we move forward and as the program continues to mature. So this is the tally. This is where we are with this effort. We have a number of sites under the parks and playgrounds that you can see for yourself. I'm going to just read to you just for an example. We have 33 that have been constructed. We have 22 that are in construction currently, and we have many more that have begun the design process. So even though you don't necessarily see a lot of activity on the ground with associated with the public agency partnerships for public properties, we have a lot of work that is underway, and we have now $45 million in design contracts, which is part of an active request for proposals. And we also, I'm looking at Patrick O'Connor here, who is now part of our team, and he's going to be leading an effort to be working on the design for these public properties. John McLaughlin on our staff is also a great ecologist, and he's going to be working very closely. I see Merritt Larson there in the back from the Parks Department, very closely with the Parks Department on initiatives on their lands. And I have a picture. Okay, we'll start with this one. This is a Trust for Public Land partnership that we have. So on these school playgrounds, right, everybody's very familiar with that asphalt from lot line to lot line playground for our schools. And what we were trying to do is work with the Trust for Public Land to really transform those sites into more active recreational opportunities, not just for the students, but also for the surrounding neighborhoods. As part of this program, they are required to keep these sites open for a longer period of time to encourage more active recreation on the part of that larger community. And what you don't really see in the picture on the right is under that turf field, which is, and I don't know if I have a light on this, but what you don't see underneath those turf fields is that we have, yeah? Oh, okay. Oh, yeah, there we go. So under here is where we would dig out and we would do stormwater detention. So that's a large volume that we can capture on that site, preventing that stormwater from going into the sewer system, thereby preserving the sewer system's capacity and reducing the propensity for combined sewer overflows. And this is a picture of the Community Parks Initiative. The Parks Department has this incredible initiative where they're funding under the de Blasio administration parks that haven't received a lot of capital investments for a very long period of time. Most of these are in underserved neighborhoods, and it was a really important initiative of the Parks Department to make those investments, and we partnered with them by contributing $30 million for these sites to include green infrastructure, right? Because this is the best opportunity when we're going to be retrofitting these properties anyway, and we're going to be, in many cases, excavating soils, that we get in there and we can look for those opportunities to do stormwater management on those sites. And these projects are really great. If anybody has seen any of them, this is Van Al's playground. That was the first one that was done, but they're really beautiful. And not only are they providing for the stormwater benefits, they're providing other community co-benefits, as we call them, because they're improving air quality, they're cooling the city, and they're providing for this recreational opportunity. So the private property, this is our last initiative with respect to our Green Infrastructure Program, and this is proving to be one of the toughest. I'll be honest with you. It is a difficult venture to incentivize the private sector to install green infrastructure on their property. New construction is really not a problem. We have detention rules that require new property owners to manage stormwater on site. Almost 90% of it must be detained on site. But how do you get people that aren't necessarily investing in their properties to potentially dig up some area or make those investments that would allow for stormwater management to happen? So what we're doing is we have a grant where we're doing 100% reimbursement. If you're a private property owner, you want to come in, you want to join our grant program, we will reimburse you 100% of the costs. So do encourage people, if you hear of anybody who might be interested in this, to come see us about this grant program. We have a rolling admission, and we have invested more than $15 million and to have converted 34 properties at this point in time. Some of them are really, really nice. And we are now looking at how do we do some longer range thinking on this. We would really like to put together an RFP and have an administrator who could potentially reduce the transactional costs of each person that would have to do business with the city or sign a grant application with the city. We're modeling this idea about having an administrator come in and collect properties, if you will, that would be willing to do this kind of transformation for green infrastructure on their sites, and then they would get paid or reimbursed an administrator's fee. The reason that that is positive for the private sector is, again, it reduces their transactional costs and direct dealings with the city for each and every project that has to get done. It has worked in Philadelphia. We're been for the last year doing a lot of work with our contracting experts and our legal experts internally, and we've also been meeting with the other municipalities that have attempted things similar to the one that I just described. And now I'm talk a little bit just about the MSFOR program, only because what an MSFOR is, it's the sort of sister to the CSO concerns, right? CSOs mean the stormwater and the sanitary flow are in one pipe headed to the treatment plant. The area of the city, about 30% that is separately sewered, means that you have one pipe for sanitary flow and one pipe for stormwater. And what we have is another obligation, a regulatory obligation, to take a look at those stormwater sources and think about what we can do to treat that stormwater before it's directly discharged. So it doesn't have any sanitary sewage, that's not our concern, but there are other pollutants that it picks up over the urban environment that then get delivered to these water bodies. So we are embarking on a new initiative with an MSFOR permit. We will have a stormwater management program for the entire city of New York that will be publicly available April-ish? August. Okay. So that's coming very soon. So it's going to be August of 18. And I thought it would be worthwhile just taking one moment to explain what's integrated watershed management. Because we don't want to be looking at the city as a CSO area or an MSFOR area. We really want to be thinking about how to integrate the concerns that we have about these pollution problems and how we can look at the land uses and the behaviors for the areas that are draining to our water bodies. And how do we seize upon the opportunities where we have some integration between what is the combined area and the separately sewered areas? You know, how can we think about this more programmatically? So this is a snapshot of Jamaica Bay, which we think is a really good case study in how to do this. And what the map shows you is that we have highlighted all of the opportunity for schools, public property, parklands, and also taking a look at what is in private ownership, how large are those lots in private ownership, what would happen if we could accomplish a 10% turnover or retrofit on those private lots. And we're starting to try to model what those investments would look like in terms of the budget that it would require, but also what would be the outcome, right? Because we're very outcome driven. We really want to see a water quality benefit for all the money that we invest. And also another initiative that's happening within the department is something that we're calling Cloudburst Planning. Cloudburst is a term that we actually borrowed from the Europeans. I think the Danish were the first potentially to coin that phrase. And this is when you get so much water that it really overwhelms the design of the sewer system. And this seems to be happening more and more as we start to move towards experiencing some of the predictions of climate change. We do seem to be having more and more of these more intense storms, and so we're trying to study what would happen here in New York City if we were to take an approach that started to look at how can you handle some of this water on the topography, on the land, because you're not going to be able to drain it all through your sewer system. And here is just one pilot project that we began. What you're seeing on the left is really the planning process, right? We looked at the community challenges, we did a flooding analysis, we laid the water over the land, said where's the water ending up when it doesn't get into your sewer system, right? So where are the problem areas and how do we troubleshoot those? And then we developed a master plan, as you see in the middle, and that red square is really calling out one of the areas where you're going to see water laying on the ground, and you want to be able to address it there because you have an opportunity. It's a public housing site. So the picture to the far right is South Jamaica Houses, that public housing site, where you do have ample opportunity in this area here to potentially manage some stormwater. It's just a lawned area today. We think it has a lot of opportunity for detention. It can be kept fairly dry and available to the community when we don't have these storms, but then when we do get a storm, you can see that we can get a lot of storage in a location like that. Okay. And with that, I will take just a few questions before I turn it over to Jim.
So if you have questions, you can just put your hand up. Your microphone works. Just hit either speak or mute. Any questions for Angela? Yeah.
Yeah, hi. When has it started yet that the green infrastructure grant opportunities for private property are available for communities that aren't in the CSO sewer sheds? Because up until now, my understanding is it's only been for CSO communities.
No, you're absolutely right. It has only been for CSO communities up to this point. That has been our priority because that is where we have commitments that we have made under consent order to meet a baseline condition. We are thinking about moving it to the MSFOR area, but we're not there yet.
Do you have a sense of the timeline or not?
Not, but if you had a particular project, I would be interested in hearing about it and where it's located. So if you have something in mind, I wouldn't hold back because the funding isn't available, because there may be other ways that we can tackle that particular project. So I would just encourage you to maybe have a conversation offline and we'll see where that is. But we are mainly concentrating in the CSO area. It's a really daunting task as it is because it covers over 60% of the city. Okay, anybody else?
Hi, thank you so much. The street end at Vernon Boulevard on the Newtown Creek, the bulkhead has already collapsed into the water, and the street itself has many sinkholes. So there's a lot of restructuring that has to occur anyway. We're getting past, I say we being Harbor Lab, which is based next door on the creek on a private property adjacent to street end. We're getting passed around agency to agency as we try to advocate for a rain garden there. And we understand that the EDC and Small Business Services is handling the bulkhead reconstruction. The DOT, of course, has the street. And so there's a lot of overlapping agencies. You're the only ones who are fully 100% invested in the idea of green infrastructure in this regard. And we're wondering if we can get a partner at the DEP to basically usher us through this. Agencies listen to agencies a lot more quickly. And I learned that actually with Astoria, the public housing, when we found a sewer leak in Hallett's Cove, partly by getting residents to get NYC to then rally, their support for DEP to do dye testing, and we found a sewer leak there. So agencies listen to agencies. In that case, you guys listen to NYC. We're hoping that in this case, maybe EDC and DOT will listen to you, but can we get a commitment that somebody from your staff will usher this through to get a rain garden put in at the end of Vernon Boulevard, to have an ally there?
Well, you can definitely get a commitment that we will have that conversation again. We have had that conversation in the past. I think it in part has been somewhat stymied by the fact that they needed to redo the bulkhead and what was happening and the status of that. But I will commit to you that we will have that conversation again. I think we need to review the designs more carefully and see what the maintenance looks like, because I think understanding the maintenance obligations for something like that would go a long way to helping us sell the project. So
Harbor Lab is next door and is committed,
yes.
And we are right now in the process of developing university partnerships, so there might be more resources.
Well, that's wonderful, because our commissioner is also, thinking through a commitment to launch a stewardship program. So we can talk a little bit more about that. If we have the ability to have that stewardship program, that can really help out with the maintenance concerns that we may have. Was there one more question? Oh, sorry. Hi, Paul.
Just like your partners, it seems like with that you've got something like a third to the half of the city. You throw the libraries in, it's quite amazing. Good quick question with the Cloudburst type environments are, the situation has changed obviously hugely quickly, and the scale of your catchment could be really significantly large. I guess I was lucky enough to build a zero discharge facility for large storms on the Bronx River. I'm wondering if you're looking at optimal capacities to do that beneath your rain gardens with either broken stone or recycled glass aggregate or some means of actually quadrupling or much greatly increasing the aquifer capacity below your soil banks.
So thank you for that question. I'll definitely take that back and discuss that further with the technical folks. Right now we are designing for the 1.5-inch storm event. So underneath those rain gardens that I was showing earlier, we do have this broken stone and the manufactured soil to promote as much infiltration as possible. But we could build them deeper. However, we start to get into some OSHA requirements and then some shoring if we go much deeper with those rain gardens. So we haven't wanted to necessarily increase the program costs that dramatically. But it is certainly something to consider as we're looking for new techniques, particularly around cloudburst planning.
Yeah, if you dig it out and fill it right way, you get OSHA is otherwise a big deal, but you don't have to get a person in there. You can basically just get your space in there. I think I've done that before.
Thanks for your thoughts. Karen?
I just want to add that the ones that Paul talked about, I worked with him on that, and we're within OSHA regs. We never went deeper than 5 feet, I think what it was. So it's possible, it was the crushed glass that, he'll explain it better than me, but it has so many different pieces and parts on it, so it divides the ability. It's better than a straight line, it's compact.
No, thank you. And just to be clear, we are using that manufactured soil, so we're using some type of stone or aggregate to create, as you're suggesting, those void spaces. So that is part of the current design.
I was just wondering if you have a comprehensive education program for the general public around green infrastructure, because I know you had some bad problems in Queens, and it's very frustrating that people don't understand what you're trying to do. And so I was wondering if you're putting an investment into educating the public, the general public, instead of these wonky people here.
I'm really glad that you raised this point, because this is something that we can do better. And we just recently have hired Bellwether. So it's a somewhat of a marketing firm, but also a public campaign manager for us. And we're very quickly going to be launching a program, because we agree that we need to do a better job there.
Take one more question and then.
Okay,
Can I just add to that? Yeah, Sean
Sure.
Schaffner from the Poop Project, and thank you so much for having this. And I just want to echo that so many of the issues that you seem to be addressing, which is having less water come into our system during CSOs, having streets that have less pollutants so that the MSFOR situation isn't as bad, and having people willing to pay for water rates. That seems like a public education program to me. And I just wanted to offer, we're producing a documentary called Flush. Bob Adamski, retired wastewater engineer from DEP, is in there, as well as other people who've been involved. John Lipscomb from Riverkeeper, Leif Percyfield, Don't Flush Me. It's live online right now, November 15th to the 21st. There's postcards in the back and with me. We're having a live screening, World Toilet Day, November 19th. So this is obviously well-timed, and I just want to publicly invite DEP to come and be on the panel after the film. I think there could be more public engagement. We'd love to offer that as a resource. And as well to everyone who's here to be sharing the film. It's online for free. But I want to emphasize, I'm not a boater, I'm not a swimmer, I'm an artist who lives in Brooklyn, and I think I have a part to play in this, and I would love to be engaged, and I'd love to engage my fellow citizens in doing that.
Thank you.
Yeah.
All right, I'm going to now turn it over to Jim Muller, our Acting Deputy Commissioner for the Bureau of Environmental Design and Construction.
Thanks, Angela. Good evening. Every time I come on after Angela, I'm a little intimidated, because 4,000 GI assets in 6 years is a pretty amazing production rate from going from zero. That's what I call going from 0 to 60. It's pretty amazing. So I love hearing that story and the things we're going to do in the future. So I'm here to talk about our gray infrastructure investments that I hopefully will equally amaze you. I'm impressed by them as well. But just this is a quick status of our CSO long-term control plan. I think most of you know we're in the middle of a long-term control plan process. We've been at this since about 2012. I'll go through several iterations of the CSO program. We've been at CSO for the better part of 20 to 25 years. After we built the last treatment plants that Commissioner Sapienza talked about, we started really moving into CSO control. And in terms of our long-term control plans, we've submitted, we have several approved. 6 plans have been approved by DEC for Alley Creek, Westchester Creek, Hutchinson River, Flushing Creek, Bronx River, Gowanus Canal, and Flushing Bay. So those have all been submitted between 2013 and 2016. We submitted those reports to DEC. We've had public meetings on them. They've been covered at annual meetings as well. We've taken a lot of input, and DEC finally approved them at the beginning of 2017, in the spring of 2017. Coney Island Creek and Newtown Creek. Newtown Creek was submitted this past June, so that's our most recent submittal. It's one of our largest proposed plans. I'll go into that in a second in terms of CSO control going forward. And Coney Island Creek was a project we actually finished there a couple of years ago for the Avid UV pumping station that reduced CSOs to the canal by about 75%. Those are still pending DEC approval. There's some Newtown, we just received comments from DEC this past week, so we're actively engaged in their review of the plan and back and forth. So there's 2 LTCPs that are basically outstanding that we still owe to DEC. One is for Jamaica Bay and the tributaries in Jamaica Bay, so the open waters of Jamaica Bay and places like Paducah Basin, Spring Creek, Hendricks Creek, and Fresh Creek. And then the East River and the open waters. So those are 2 LTCPs remaining. They're also 2 of the largest water body, aerial extent water bodies or waterways in the city. So pretty challenging. We've been engaged in active water quality sampling, pretty extensive sampling program. Keith Mahoney's on the panel with me. He's the director of the program, working with me. And we've been engaged in very heavy sampling and model development. And we're going to move into alternatives development in terms of what we can do about CSOs in those places. So that's just an overview of the status of the program. So our baseline conditions. We've had a lot of discussions on these. I see a lot of familiar faces that have been at public meetings before. So when you go to look at CSO improvements, you usually have to establish a baseline of what you want to improve from. And one of the keys there is establishing a baseline of rainfall. What's your rainfall basis going to be? And another key element for us as we look at the sewer system, as Commissioner Sapienza mentioned, we do a lot of investments in sewers. 25% of our capital plan going forward is just for sewers. So our dry weather flow is a key piece of capacity that actually displaces wet weather flow. And this top line on here is water demand over time. And you can see it's really been coming down over the last 20 years or so. We've gotten a gain, a hidden gain from that water conservation, which is sewer capacity for wet weather flow. So it actually increases our wet weather capacity or our wet weather capture as our dry weather flow goes down. A lot of that's due to low flow toilets, some of the fixtures we take for granted today that were not around 20 years ago. We're just starting maybe to hit the market and make inroads 20 years ago. So that's been a tremendous gain on just the CSO program without any future investment. That's been a tremendous gain that continues. It was actually pretty amazing to me, the physics of that as population continues to grow, and it has grown over the last 20 years. This really fights that trend in terms of dipping in terms of our actual flow that we treat. Pretty amazing. So when we look, so that's our dry weather flow. So we project forward to 2040. We take into account population projections based on this actual water conservation, and then we make these projections. Work very closely with Angela and her group and city planning in terms of understanding those projections, try to anchor it to official projections and development. And then we layer on rainfall. Okay, so we establish our dry weather flow projected out to 2040, and then we layer on rainfall. One of the questions we get is, well, how are you taking into account climate change? More intense events, more heavier rains, more rain during the year. And one thing, and I'll credit Angela and her group, Alan Cohen, with this a few years back, they looked at historical rain record going back to the early 1970s, so about 50 years of rainfall. And at the time, this is 2011, they took the most recent 10 years, which was this, if you can see on the plot, this green swath of columns is rainfall each year for those 10 years. And it happened to be, we were getting a lot more rain in those 10 years. And this red line on here is a 5-year average over the 50 years. You can see this 5-year average of rainfall, wet weather flow, is its peak. That's the highest over the last 50 years. So we've actually incorporated that into our alternatives analysis. When we recommend a plan, we run it through this 10-year rain record. And we keep it going. You see this is just for comparison purposes. The rainfall since then has actually dipped. You see the 5-year actually goes down. But when we make these projections, we're basing it on the max 5-year, or incorporating our 10-year analysis, is the max 5-year average period for the whole 50-year record. So that's one of our ways. We're not assuming low flow conditions for rain. We're not assuming drought conditions. We're actually assuming pretty peak wet weather conditions based on recent experience as opposed to historical record that would suggest much lower averages. That's one way we do it. Another way, we run an average year. In 2008, when Angela and her team looked at this whole rain record, they selected 2008 as kind of a representative year, particularly for this 10-year period. And you see that 2008 column actually peaks right at the 5-year. That 5-year peak, that 5-year average peak, is actually representative of the 2008 average year. So what we do when we formulate alternatives, when we look at infrastructure, we look at various levels of control, and we layer on dry weather flow projecting out to 2040, and layer on rainfall. We start with 2008 and run it through that whole year. It's about 120 storms. Actual storms, run it through that whole year and say, how do we do on capture? You're going to see some of the results of that. And then when we're done, we use that as kind of a screening basis to screen out maybe 50 alternatives or 20 alternatives. And then we get down to what we think is our recommended plan. We run it through the whole 10-year record, which is about 1,300 storms. Okay, so that's how rigorous we try to get around what are the conditions this infrastructure is going to be under, and how will that impact CSO? So that's one of our ways, A, to account for climate change, and B, to account for a lot of varying conditions that these pieces of infrastructure that we'll invest in will be under. So that's kind of our baseline. Out of that comes, this is kind of our summary of projects that we've produced, kind of a dashboard of types of projects that we've produced using that kind of analysis, looking at water quality, and I'll show you the water quality projections in a second, in terms of each of these water bodies that we've submitted to DEC, what the kind of technology we've chosen for CSO control. And there's two colored checks on here. One is, I'm going to call it purple. Hopefully you see it as purple as well. And one is green. So the ones that are in the darker color, purple, blue, are previous investments that we recommended before this LTCP process. Because we've been investing in CSO for a couple of decades, significant investments. And you can see this quite a lot. Gowanus Canal, Flushing Bay, Newtown Creek, Alley Creek, Hutchinson River. We invested in storage prior. Before the LTCP planning process, we invested in storage for CSO. Oh, I'm sorry, I have this wrong. The greens are the prior. Oh, we switched this up. Greens are the prior and the LTC, the dark blue is the LTCPs. So you see the green, storage, Alley Creek, Flushing Creek, Jamaica Tribs, Pattagate Basin, Spring Creek. Those are our 4 CSO storage tanks. Spring Creek was our first CSO storage tank that came online in 1972. And it was aimed at beach protection out in Jamaica Bay. And we've been building storage over time ever since. That was our past program. Under the LTCPs, we've recommended additional elements in Flushing Bay, Newtown Creek, Gowanus Canal. Sewer system optimization, disinfection as we built storage. So our next phase in LTCPs is adding disinfection onto some of those storage tanks. So we stored the volume first. There's still overflows because we don't design these tanks to capture every storm. They become really, really big and really, really expensive. I'll show that in a bit in the graph. But we add on disinfection to treat the additional overflow. It doesn't happen that often. You might capture 60 or 70% of the flow fully. And then what overflows, it's kind of more infrequent because it's larger storms that don't happen all the time. But then you'll disinfect the overflows. That's the strategy there. For the sewer system improvements, we've invested a lot prior in terms of fixed weirs, raising the heights of regulators. Want to be sure we don't flood out communities, but maybe capture more CSO. Newtown Creek, we've recommended additional sewer system optimization in terms of pumping station expansions. I'll talk about that. Bronx River in terms of moving flow out of the Bronx River and Hutch River as well. So we're really after 2 types of CSO control. One is volume reduction, which is really your storage, optimizing flow to the treatment plant, optimizing the system to capture more storms. We've invested heavily in that. And the other is reducing the bacteria load. Whatever remains, can you knock down the pathogens that are going out into the water body? We do a lot of post-construction monitoring. For all of those approved LTCPs, we have to go out with a pretty extensive post-construction monitoring program and say, well, we made these projections, how are we doing? How are we doing based on dissolved oxygen? How are we doing based on pathogens? How are we doing on floatables control? We'll take some report cards on that and measure, aesthetically how the water body looks. So we do extensive post-construction monitoring. So this is kind of the result of those prior investments. So as Commissioner Sapienza mentioned, back in the mid-'80s, 110 billion gallons a year of CSO would discharge annually. And a lot of that was because the treatment plants hadn't been fully built out. So priority 1 was build out the treatment plants, get that flow to the treatment plants. And that was achieved by the end of the 1980s. Since then, we've been aimed at now continuing to knock down the CSO. So this green column are the money invested, right? The previous money invested that I just described. $4.1 billion has been spent in that category to remove another 5.6 billion gallons of CSO flow. About $1 a gallon, a little bit less, 80 cents a gallon, right? If you divide the capital by the annual. Now we're getting into the flatter part of the curve. As Commissioner Sapienza showed, it just starts flattening out. The gains become harder and harder to get. That's just how everything is. So our next phase of the program that we've already recommended in the LTCP is another 4.4 billion following. You're only getting 2.5 billion gallons of reduction now. It's harder and harder to get those reductions. So we're just starting to flatten out, where this is getting close to $2 a gallon, where before it might have been 80 cents a gallon. Right? So on a normalized basis, just much more expensive to get this kind of capture. That's why things like that Angela was talking about, the green, we're keenly interested in, not only for the control on CSO, but synergies with the neighborhood and greening neighborhoods, maybe reducing heat island effect and that kind of thing. So really really pretty neat program. But that's also embodied in this $4.4 billion. So that's kind of the summary. So in terms of how we're doing on water quality, dissolved oxygen is one criteria. There's a lot of things that impact dissolved oxygen. I know a lot of you have a lot of water quality backgrounds here. Some of you have pretty great backgrounds in water quality. A lot of factors impact dissolved oxygen, from the depth of the water body to the mixing that happens there, the eutrophication, to things like CSOs. So all of those kind of come into play. But our annual attainment, when we look at over a year, on DO, we look pretty good system-wide from a dissolved oxygen perspective. There are pockets, as Commissioner Sapiens has showed, there are still pockets of issues with water quality. But on a broad basis, most of our area in the harbor does very well against the Class I standard, which is greater than 4 milligrams per liter. And a lot of it does very well against the primary contact of the 4.8, which is a chronic standard where you can go from 3 to 4.8 for certain times of the day. It's a little archaic to explain, so I apologize for that. But we do pretty well based on a DO standard for large parts of the harbor. Gowanus Canal is an SD water body, but with the flushing tunnel, we've done very well against CSO there. And Newtown Creek is still SD, never less than 3, and it's got a lot of challenges. So I'm going to talk about Newtown and specifically in terms of what we're proposing for CSO. So here's the pathogen story. So that was dissolved oxygen. Now we're going to talk about pathogens. These are all the water bodies that I kind of highlighted before that we submitted LTCPs for. The first bar on here, the blue bar, the dark, I'm not from Boston, the dark blue bar, for the most part, we're showing 100% attainment. And that's with the 2008 year, right, that I showed you before, that about 46 inches of rain that year. I'll show you the storm distribution, so it does vary year by year. But 100% attainment in that year during the recreational season. So what is the recreational season? It's May 1st to October 31st. So it's a 6-month period where for that 6 months out of the year, that's actually classified by DEC. It used to be May 15th to September 15th, so it used to be 4 months. They actually expanded it 2 weeks on the early end and 6 weeks on the back end, and now it's a 6-month rec season, which is reflective of the uses in the water body. People are getting out there more, and even in September, October, it's actually a nice day on the water. So they're reflecting that those uses are going up, which has expanded the rec season. So it's a 6-month recreational period, 100% compliance from a pathogen standpoint with fecal. So DEC changed their rules, I believe it was late 2015 or 2016, that fecal coliform is now the pathogen indicator regardless of how the water body's classified. Now I'm going outside of beaches now, I'm just talking about water bodies. That's the indicator that we're going to measure compliance against. And they made a rulemaking on that, so that's our official indicator. We still measure it against Intera. So we know the Beach Act, EPA came out with the Beach Act. Still, how that's going to be applied is a question, right? So it's clearly beaches, the Beach Act would apply to. Now, how is it going to apply to the rest of these water bodies? That's a question we're still working through. But we measure a sensitivity against that in terms of how do we do on Intera. And we look at geomeans and we look at some other indicators there as well. Intera is a lot harder to meet in a lot of these water bodies than fecal, and that's what this shows. Even the 10-year, when we look at a 10-year period, so that light blue, the next line down, is the 10-year record. So I showed you that 2008 record, and I showed you the 10-year. We run it through both, our recommended plan. So 2008, we did pretty well. Less storms, and not as intense storms occurred during that year. The 10-year period, run 1,300 storms through. We got a lot of bigger storms in that 10-year period. We do worse on compliance for some of these water bodies. Not horrible, 87 or 100%, 85, 100%, but for the bigger storms, you're going to have more CSOs. We might have 25-year storms. They happen once every 25 years. We captured them in the 10-year period. So we're not designing to capture those storms. Again, it gets incredibly expensive to focus gray infrastructure on capturing storms of that magnitude, but we still measure compliance against it because it's a real thing that this infrastructure is going to be under. And like I said, the 10-year Intero geomean, it's just much harder for the most part for these water bodies to meet that. A lot of reasons for that, but it is a much tougher standard. So again, we're in that conversation with our regulators in terms of how that'll be judged. And these aren't beaches; they're not places where people are bathing and 2 million or 3 million people are visiting a year. We still want to be protective. So we're going through that. Kind of iteration. So I'm a graphical guy. I am an engineer. Sorry, I'm a civil engineer, so I apologize. But I do like the graphs. So basically, this red line on here is the 2008 storm distribution. Right? It's a percentile, cumulative percentile, storm size, which is just inches per storm. And you can see it cuts off right about here. The 99% of the storms were basically between less than a 1-year occurrence or a 2-year occurrence. So it's about 100 storms we run through. That's about 100 to 120 storms a year. That's kind of where that storm distribution lies. Overall, it's still, that total volume that year matches the 5-year peak average during that 10-year period. So we're pretty happy with that. But when we ran the 10-year record, you could see we get into much larger storms. There's a 25-year storm in there. There's a 35-year frequent storm in there. These are big storms. These are your nor'easters, right? These might be some of your hurricanes. Our hurricanes. I'm under them too, right? So, but we run it through. We'll run it through. How does those impact water quality? And you know, there's an impact, and that's measured in our percent attainment goes down for those larger storms. So this is just a graphical depiction of why this happens. Why a 10-year record is different than a 1-year record. A lot of things go into it. So I just want to explain that. So this is kind of a summary, water body by water body, of what we've done and what we plan to do. So Flushing Bay, DEC approved this on March 7th of this year, 2017. So our approved project there is 50% capture for a CSO storage tunnel, 25 million gallon CSO storage tunnel. Our escalated cost for that project, we anticipate DEC's approved a 15-year implementation period. We're still working through the schedule details, but our escalated costs on that are $1.6 billion, all included, which includes construction and the soft costs for design and the soft costs for construction management. So this is a major investment in Flushing Bay. Again, approved schedule of 15 years, something on the order of this investment. That's how long it takes to site things and to build this kind of stuff. But major investment that's approved by DEC, and we're moving forward with for Flushing Bay. Prior investments under the water body watershed facility plans included much lower cost investments, about $70 million, looking at taking flow out of the Flushing Bay area, moving in over to the low-level side of the Barry Bay drainage area, doing dredging, and modifying some of the regulators to try to capture more storms. And we thought we had that opportunity there. So the shorter-term investment was $70 million to try to get CSO reduction and more CSO out of Flushing Bay. The longer-term investment is the CSO storage tunnel, 15-year time frame approved by DEC. Flushing Creek, going forward, we're looking at seasonal disinfection. So during that recreational period, that 6-month period that I explained, about $18 million for disinfection. The big investment in Flushing already occurred. We built a big storage tank on one of the largest outfalls into Flushing Creek. That came online in 2006, 2007, so it's been operating for the better part of a decade. $363 million was the past investment. So we want to add to that, start disinfecting the overflows that bypass that tank, because again, it's not designed to capture every storm. That's our plan there. So all told, just these two projects alone for Flushing Bay and Creek, approaching $2 billion of capital just for this one area. So I think this, again, demonstrates we're on the flatter part of the curve here in terms of your gains that you're going to get. It just becomes tougher and tougher to get. Newtown Creek, another big water body, a lot of CSO going into it. We've proposed 2 projects. One is a shorter term project and one's a longer term project. The first project, big project, the longer term project, is almost a 39 million gallon CSO storage tunnel. 62.5% CSO capture is what we project. $1.4 billion of capital in that location, escalated costs. And that's likely to go up. I think that is actually low. It's not approved yet by DEC. We're going through a lot of comments back and forth with them, but that's the project as proposed. Prior, we invested a couple $100 million in improving DO, floatables control, optimizing the system, and expanding the plant. So the Newtown Creek plant in beautiful Greenpoint, Brooklyn, we expanded it from 620 million gallons per day wet weather capacity to 700 million gallons per day wet weather capacity. Get more wet weather flow into that plant. So that's a lot of that prior investment was aimed at the treatment plant and then the drainage area in terms of optimizing. So we've been investing in that area for CSO control for some time. The big investment is yet to come in terms of the CSO storage tunnel. The shorter term project is actually expanding one of our pumping stations on Dutch Kills. So the storage tunnel is aimed at the 3 outfalls in the back part of the creek, NCB 15, which is in English Kills, NCB 83, which is in East Branch, and NC 77, which is on Maspeth Creek. They're really far from the plant, tough to deal with. You know, there's satellite area. There's about 300 million gallons of CSO going out from each outfall, so it's a lot. That's why we're recommending a storage tunnel. And we're recommending running it from these outfalls all the way to the treatment plant and pumping it out to the treatment plant for treatment. That's our goal. So again, we're in a heavy discussion with DEC on that. Our shorter term project is up is up in in Dutch Kills, sorry. So, which is up here. Here's Dutch Kills, right by the community college up there. We have a small pumping station that exists there. It's about 3 MGD total flow. We're actually recommending upgrading it to about 25 million gallons per day, wet weather flow, and running a force main from the pumping station, which is on this side of the creek, over to the treatment plant. I'm pumping it right out to the treatment plant. That's about a $90 million project for the pumping station. Shorter term project, we can do that quicker. Again, the tunnel is on the order of 1.4 billion. Again, I think that number's low. But our total investments there approach 1.7 billion, at least those we've estimated there today. So Newtown, a lot of investment. We've done a lot, particularly around the treatment plant over the last 20 years. More to come in the drainage area over the next 20. Bronx River, conveyance improvements. Prior, we invested heavily in the Hunts Point treatment plant, upgrading the headworks in Hunts Point, trying to get more flow to Hunts Point, which Bronx River is in that drainage area. That's the $46 million annual cost in the waterbody watershed facility plan projects. Going forward, we're looking at moving flow out of the Bronx River, more downstream toward the treatment plant, trying to treat more of it. Almost $200 million of pipe improvements to get that flow out of there. Relief at HPO 007 and 009, which are right on the Bronx River, two of the largest outfalls, and doing flow control at HP 11. Again, almost $200 million on the Bronx River for a total cost of $231 million for that area. Alley Creek, we had invested prior, a lot of stormwater investment. For those of you who might know that area of Queens, you remember in the 90s, very flood-prone area. We invested out of this $151 million or $139 million in the green. A lot of that investment was in storm sewers, trying to improve the drainage in the area and improve the quality of life. And we also invested in the CSO storage tank as part of it. A really nice synergy kind of project where you're building these storm sewers. We also found an opportunity to build the CSO storage tank. Now we're going to add to that CSO storage tank with add-on disinfection. So most of the investment was made prior, and now this is kind of just disinfecting what overflows through the tank. $151 million total investment, most of that sunk costs, past costs. Hutchinson River, we had invested, again, the Hunts Point headworks improvements that I talked about earlier. Most of that really improved Bronx River and somewhat Westchester Creek. A little bit for Hutch River, so we've got a little allocation there for that. But most of the project is ahead of us in terms of CSO control, about $170 million that we proposed a plan for Hutch River that's approved by DC and we're moving forward on, which is basically one of the largest outfalls in Hutch River. Build a conduit, 10-foot diameter kind of tunnel, quarter-mile tunnel, and disinfect the overflows from that with floatables control. There's some scalability to that over time that we might add to it down the line, but there's other inputs to the Hutch River as well that kind of complicate the issues. This kind of made the most sense from a first step. $170 million total cost for the Hutch River, most of that in front of us. CSO disinfection. So I've talked a little bit about CSO disinfection. I know it's a little bit of a controversial topic. When we say disinfection, what we mean is we're going to chlorinate and we're also going to dechlorinate. So we're going to hit it with the chlorine, kill the pathogens, and before it's released to the water body, we're going to hit it with sodium bisulfite and knock down the chlorine. So that when we discharge, that discharge is not heavily chlorine laden, that maybe we're killing critters in the water body, which is not our goal. So it's a chlor-dechlor alternative so anywhere I'm saying disinfection, I'm talking about chlorination, dechlorination. It's something that's used pretty commonly. We've been chlorinating at the treatment plants for decades, and now we're starting to dechlorinate at the treatment plants just because of concerns with chlorine toxicity. So we're going to take the same approach with the CSOs. Yeah, I mean, liquid chlorine has proven to be an incredible disinfectant, over time. If you look nationally, a lot of places use it for, that's their kind of disinfection technology of choice. We're always looking at new technologies, always open to that, but seems like the most tried and true for the application that we're looking at for the CSOs. And it's in 3 places that we're looking at that disinfection. So we're not taking that approach everywhere. It is a combined approach. We continue to have a diverse program. So additional investments. Coney Island Creek, as mentioned, the Avenue V pumping station, almost $200 million we put into upgrading that pumping station, building an enormous force main to get a lot of the wet weather flow out of Coney Island Creek, up to 3/4 of it out of Coney Island Creek toward the Owl's Head treatment plant. We do a lot of flow monitoring. Illicit connections is always an issue that we face in all of our drainage areas, which is dry weather overflows. People can connect improperly to storm sewers. There's a lot of reasons those things happen, so we continue to, in places like Coney Island Creek, we continue to identify those issues and work with the local community and elected officials to try to address it, and work with DEC as well. And it's also, as Pinar mentioned before, Pinar Balsi, who's on the panel, it's also an MS4 priority water body for stormwater. So there's a large stormwater load to that water body, so that's kind of on Pinar's hit list in terms of the stormwater focus. Gowanus Canal, we sunk almost $200 million in investment into the canal in terms of upgrading the wastewater treatment plant, wastewater pumping station, I should say, and the flushing tunnel, bringing in oxygenated water, oxygen-rich water from the East River into the canal. We've seen real gains there for DO and for pathogens. We have pretty high level compliance actually with primary contact in the canal. I know there's different issues at times, this issue of illicit connections. If people remember last year, a local, one of those cola head companies, right, with the porta potties was actually fined $1 million because they were illegally dumping into Gowanus at like midnight or 1 in the morning. So those things happen. Does impact water quality. We'll pick it up on our water quality sampling and say, well, that's not really wet weather related. What's going on? So those, we continue to try to monitor for those things and protect the water bodies as well. But we think those infrastructure investments have really made real gains in terms of improving chronic water quality conditions. There is a Superfund requirement for Gowanus Canal, almost $1 billion for 2 tanks, storage tanks that we're actually investing in Gowanus Canal for to meet our Superfund requirements. So that's ahead of us. That's not a long-term control plan project, but a mandate under the Superfund. And then there's Westchester Creek, pretty innovative strategy with sewer system optimization strategy, $120 million, where we're getting a huge gain in terms of modifying the sewer system and getting 60 or 70% capture for CSO. So pretty great project there. So a lot of money spent in a lot of different places on CSO control. So this is what's ahead of us. The Jamaica Bay and Tribs, Paddocket Basin, we built a huge CSO storage tank on the Paddocket Basin. We finished that in, I think, 2009, 2010 time frame. Almost $400 million on CSO storage was invested in Paddocket. A lot of other improvements were invested in Jamaica Bay as well. Sewer system improvements, high-level storm sewers, dredging, destratification in Shellbank, trying to break up that mixing. I mentioned before there's a lot of different reasons why water quality issues occur. Some of these tributaries are 40 feet deep, and in the summer they just don't mix. Wet weather improvements at 26 Ward, building the new Warnerville pumping station and force main, bending weirs, parallel interceptors, lateral sewers, a lot of investments in Jamaica Bay. So almost $1 billion invested in Jamaica Bay for wet weather improvement between Paddocket and the other investments in Jamaica Bay. Pretty to me, impressive investments in terms of the gains we get by decreasing that wet weather flow. East River Open Waters, a lot of investments in the treatment plants, Bowery Bay Headworks, Port Richmond Throttling Facility, Tallman Island Parallel Conveyance, regulator improvements in our collection system, as Commissioner Sapienza mentioned in the beginning, how the sewer system works. That's a regulator. $200 million of actual costs. So what does all that mean? We've got schedules that are approved now by DEC that we're now beholden to and we're moving forward with. So Alley Creek, you see the facility planning, land acquisition, the blue lines on here are all the lead effort, and all the construction is highlighted in the orange. But a lot of these projects are, like I said, we've sunk a lot. There's a lot of infrastructure working. But the next phase of projects, the add-on disinfection, more CSO storage, they're coming. So Alley Creek, 2025, Hutchinson River, 2026, 2027. You can see this on the plot. Flushing Bay, Newtown Creek, 2 of the longer timelines on here. This is billions of dollars of investment. That's just how long it takes those investments to percolate, to get in order, to get the siting, to get that project built. The nice story on Newtown, well, first of all, Flushing Creek, we've invested in storage already. So we've started storing. We've invested interim in Flushing Bay in terms of modifying the system and trying to get more to the plant. Newtown Creek, that's the Borden Avenue pumping station. We think we can finish that in 10 to 12 years. $90 million investment, start getting Dutch kills, 75% capture in Dutch kills, pumping it over to the treatment plant. The tunnel's going to take a lot longer for those three back-ended outfalls. Much more aggressive project. And then Jamaica Bay and Tribs and the open waters, they're in front of us. We haven't finalized those plans. We'll be doing a lot of public meetings citywide. You should be on those invite lists. We've seen a lot of you at the public meetings. Really appreciate your input and your participation and your passion about it, and we'll continue to do that. So one barometer, and Commissioner Sapienza has really pushed us on this to say, well, what's the best we could do? If we got 100% CSO capture, what would our attainment look like? And 100% CSO capture comes with an estimated price tag of upwards of $30 billion. So it's a massive program, right? But just as a benchmark, what's the best we can do? And you can see on an annual basis, we're already at 100% attainment with our recommended projects for the most part. So not a lot of dent there. But when you look at the 10-year record, yeah, these areas were pretty good, but you still got a lot. It's just hard to move the bar in these locations. It's not all due to CSO. There's other inputs. We have a pretty wide, diverse program in a lot of areas, as Angela was mentioning, on stormwater control, cloudburst planning, that kind of thing. So this alone doesn't really move that bar. So that's something we keep in the back of our heads of like, what's the best, if we took out every drop, or for the most part every drop, for a reasonably sized storm, what's the best we could do? Some of these, it's just not a CSO problem. And it's not, we're kind of on the flatter part of the curve. And that's just the reality that we deal with. I know you as our partners, as our stakeholders, have to deal with that. Like, what does that mean? Where's the smartest place to spend money? But this is just kind of a way that we benchmark that against in terms of the best we could do. So this slide's a little busy, and I'm going to transition right back to Angela, so I'm not going to be too long. But what I just talked about in fairly great detail is just the CSO program. And as Commissioner Sapienza started in the beginning, we do a lot more than just CSO. We do water supply, we do wastewater treatment, sewers, water mains, distribution, conveyance from upstate. And what this is this is basically in one snapshot all our competing needs and risks on one slide. 200-year forecast. I have a 200-year forecast because a lot of our infrastructure lasts for 200 years. So when we build something today, an intersector, a tunnel, a water tunnel, we have to project conditions out 200 years because that's how long that's going to be around. That's this bottom, these kind of black lines, those are our existing infrastructure. As Commissioner Sapienza mentioned, 175 years ago they started investing. Some of that infrastructure is still in service. We have to take that into account. That's a competing need. Here's our CSO, here's our commitment plan in 10-year increment, and our CSO orders right here. So we're in the midst of implementing a lot. I just talked about we've already invested a lot. We plan to invest a lot more. That's one piece of the pie. There's a lot of existing infrastructure. All these black lines are existing assets that have to be maintained. If we don't maintain them, they will fail. And then we'll react to emergencies. We don't like to be there. And then you have these risks. MSFOR programs are risk. Where's that going to go? And as a competing need, where does it make more sense to invest in stormwater or CSO? It's a great question. And it's one we're still working through. Total residual chlorine at the treatment plants. Where's that going? Right? Are we going to look at UV treatment everywhere for 25, 40 years from now? Well, that comes with a lot of cost. Our filtration avoidance upstate for the water supply system. Are we going to have to filter that? So a lot of risks, a lot of needs, climate change on it. Some of these gray lines are all about the future, so it's gray because it's hard to predict the future. But population projections, development, where's that going? Water rate affordability analysis, which Angela's going to talk about next. Climate change forecast, how's that going to impact where we're going to need to invest? So factoring all that in, that's one of our challenges. So that's why the CSO program is built out over time. You try to get those low-hanging pieces of fruit in the beginning, and as you move in, you just try to make gains and gains and gains over time as we try to balance everything else we have to do. Really appreciate your time. I don't think we're going to stop for questions from me, right? I'll turn it over to Angela, but I will be on the panel and happy to answer any questions as needed. And it's a pleasure to reintroduce Deputy Commissioner Angela Lucado.
Thanks so much, Jim. That was an incredible amount of information packed into that presentation. So maybe you've noticed we'd like to really, consider ourselves problem solvers in the department, and we're working daily on these issues, trying to provide the best services that we can, trying to develop the best planning tools that we can, and really study what is this impact, right? We know we can come up with these projects, we develop these great engineering proposals, but we really then need to take stock of where are we, what is the value of the project and the program that we're proposing, and what is the impact going to be on our ratepayers, right? Because at the end of the day, people have to be able to afford to pay for water and sewer services. So essentially what I'm showing here on this slide is basically how, if you look from 1990 to 2016, which is what is shown on the time horizon on the x-axis here, you can see that essentially household incomes in New York City are fairly stagnant, right? They haven't really been changed, they haven't changed or been modified very dramatically over that time period. At the same time, however, we have had to increase our cost of services because of these great projects and programs that we're bringing. A lot of them are really important projects for safe drinking water and for wastewater treatment, but they do come at a cost. And you can see right here there's an inflection point in and around 2000, 2004 as we start to sharply increase those water and sewer rates. Basically, since that period of time, those rates increased about 160%. And these legal mandates and these projects that we propose every day to ensure the safety of our harbors and ensure the safety of our drinking water, which is paramount to us, is, we really are looking to structure our debt over time where it's appropriate for payback periods. And we are essentially providing very strong borrowing costs. So New York City DEP is in a really wonderful position. We're probably one of the strongest utilities, I would say, in the country. We really do enjoy great competitive interest rates on our municipal bonds. So that's really truly a benefit for the projects that we are proposing to do, because we can bring them at the lowest cost possible. And basically our costs are just a little over a penny a gallon for water. And that's really amazing, right? So it's still a fairly affordable product that we're delivering. If you look at just the mandates alone from 2006 to 2017, 48% of the capital investments were mandated. And the problem with this is that we tend to then compete with other department needs, right? So then there becomes a lot of tension on state of good repair and our aging infrastructure. All those conversations playing out on the national stage are really happening very close to home as well. And the mandates, those mandates that I just mentioned, cost the average homeowners $229 a year to pay for those projects. For instance, Newtown Creek that Jim mentioned and the wet weather increases, the wet weather capacity increases for treatment there, that accounts for about $75 a year on your average bill. And we've heard a lot, I think we're trying to hit this message home, and we're coming to a point of diminishing returns. What this very complicated slide is really showing you is that you have time again on the x-axis, and then you have your annual CSO volume captured, so that's shown, whoopsie, didn't mean to do that. That's this blue line here. So you can see, as Jim mentioned, here we are, secondary treatment, stepping into the programs over time. We see a very sharp decrease for the investments that were made at that time period. Now as we're starting to come down here, we're seeing that it's getting harder and harder for us to get that volume, those additional volumes out of the system. And then with respect to the cumulative costs, we can see that that line is trending in the opposite direction. So this is a projection going out to 2045. You can see that we're increasing those costs here in the tens of billions, and we're looking at capturing this additional volume for that investment. So that's just the thought that I'd like to leave you with, and we could talk more about that on the panel, unless Mikkel has other instructions for us. All right, thank you very much for being such a patient audience.
Thank you, Angela. So before we get going into the question and answer panel, I just wanted to highlight, Jim went through a tremendous amount of information about a lot of different water bodies, talking about early investments and planned investments through the LTCP. So what we've unveiled this evening is new water body fact sheets that are available at the back. I think some of you picked them up as you were coming in. But that gives a more comprehensive overview of the specific water body and goes into a lot more detail than what Jim was able to go through tonight. So not only the earlier investments, the planned investments, but the projected water quality impacts. So please make sure to pick those up before you head out. So I know that you had a chance to meet Jim and Angela, but I want to give our other panelists an opportunity to introduce themselves and talk just for a brief moment about what they do at DEP, and then we'll open it up to the floor for questions. So Keith, can you kick us off?
Hi, I'm Keith Honan with the New York City DEP. I'm the Director of Water Quality Improvement. Essentially, that's right now overseeing the Combined Sewer Overflow Long-Term Control Plan program, and I also have a modeling section where we're developing different landside models, water quality models, used for resiliency, used for other efforts such as nitrogen removal, things like that. So that's essentially what I do. But thanks.
Good evening, I'm Pam Alardo. Is this working? Yes. So I am the Deputy Commissioner for the Bureau of Wastewater Treatment. And what I do is run all of the wastewater treatment plants, the associated collection system, 96 pumping stations, 497 regulator stations, 24/7 operation. I take credit for the whales coming back to our New York waters. You can thank my staff. And so obviously very interested in everything we're doing as a department. Particularly my staff will be the ones operating, maintaining, taking care of, and participating in design and construction of the CSO projects and anything else that's associated with the long-term care of our investments.
Good evening, everyone. I'm Pınar Balsi. I'm the Assistant Commissioner for Environmental Planning and Analysis, and our group does most of the sustainability portfolio in DEP, ranging from water conservation, green infrastructure for on-site and private retrofits. We also do a lot of wetland restoration projects, working with Merit, and we have another arm that has been working with most of you on the MSFOR Stormwater Management Plan compilation and release for next year. And lastly, we have a large group here at DEP. We do a lot of environmental quality reviews, so all the projects, infrastructure projects under Jim's group can get the environmental quality reviews approved and accepted before we can start construction.
Thanks, Pinar. So again, put your hand up. I'll call on folks. Make sure to hit your microphone so that we can hear your question. We have quite a bit of time for that before we close out. Miss Argenti, please kick us off.
Hi. I would like to know when we're going to have the meetings for the long-term control plan for the Holland River and the open waters. We're waiting, it's another December, and I'm ready to get everybody out, but I need to know what the dates are.
Can I answer that, even though I'm not on the panel? We will kick off in January, and actually before we close out, we have more specific information than that, but just a couple more months. Okay, great. That's a great point. If you did write down questions or you plan to, make sure that you leave them at the back table so that we can respond to those comments. Yes, ma'am. No, you.
Hi, my name is Claudia, and I have a question for Jim for the long-term control plan for the Bronx River. The volume that you're reducing, that will be going into the improved pipes. Where is that going to go?
So we're going to route that toward the East River, try to get that flow toward the Hunts Point treatment plant. And some of it, depending on the size of the storm, some of it may overflow to the East River, but it will get out of the Bronx River. For the most part, we're trying to get it to the treatment plant for wet weather treatment at Hunts Point.
Okay, so water quality is really depending on whether the plant will be able to treat that water.
Well, it'll get out of the Bronx River either way, so it'll improve water quality in the Bronx River. Where it does overflow, and we do project that, where we might overflow more to some water bodies, and we've factored that into our projections. East River has a lot of, we call it assimilative capacity, where it can handle those infrequent overflows. For the most, but so our strategy is really to get it to Hunts Point, and depending on the size of the storm, it might overflow in a different place than it does now. So our first goal is to get it out of the Bronx River toward the treatment plant. For larger storms, it might also overflow to the East River, but it would not impact the Bronx River. Does that make sense?
It's impacting our water bodies either way?
No, it would impact the East River, but we think the East River can handle that infrequent impact, that it's not like a daily occurrence. It's pretty infrequent.
Lewis?
Angela, on the GI program, are you able to work with our friends at the state and federal levels for their problems regarding our contamination?
I'm not sure I understand your question.
Well, there's a lot of contamination that occurs at both the state and the federal level here in the city. Your GI basically is restricted to New York City areas. And what about all those other, like buses and things like that?
Well, we do, when we're targeting the green infrastructure, we are targeting solutions that would address the land side, the land uses. So I guess in a certain respect we are. If you have a specific instance or a specific facility that you're looking for us to address, I would definitely be interested in knowing what that is. But we do try to take a land side approach. So we do try to study what are all the top land uses within a watershed and how can we best address those various categories of land uses.
Thank you, Angela. Yes.
Yeah, I was wondering, where do the DEP ships go? Do they still do ocean dumping?
Okay, you want to get that one?
No, we don't do ocean dumping. The practice stopped a long time ago. So what happens is we do have ships that take the solids that aren't yet processed. It's called sludge from the treatment plants that don't have the final solids processing to the treatment plants that do have the final solids processing, which is called dewatering. So we have 6 treatment plants that do dewatering. We have 14 treatment plants overall. Some of the sludge from the ones without dewatering is transported to the ones that do the final solids treatment. So that's what the ships do. So if you see them out in the harbors, that's what they're doing.
Thanks, Pam. Yeah, Corinne?
Hi, my name's Corinne. Can I ask 2 questions?
Yeah.
First question, could you update us on the Spring Creek disinfection study and if that's complete and if that's going to inform Flushing Creek, Alley Creek, and the Hutchinson River? There's a lot of concern, especially in Flushing Creek and I believe in Alley Creek and Hutchinson River, that there is a large oyster population and we're worried that there will still be residual chlorine from disinfection, and we want to ensure that you are able to dechlorinate variant CSO volumes. Second question about the WAIT program and about CSO notifications in general. I get the New York City, the New York State CSO notifications. I was getting the WAIT notifications when they were happening, and it seems like there's a lot of different ways to get notifications and with varying effectiveness, and I'm just wondering what the next steps are and if there's going to be a more cohesive and easy to understand notification program in the future. Thanks.
So Pam, do you want to take disinfection?
Yes, I do. Yeah. I think a lot about disinfection. So let me just do a little bit of a disinfection story. So at the wastewater treatment plants where the flow is pretty constant, we do have some variability obviously with storms, we disinfect and using hypochlorite, the sodium, which is like a bleach. And then what we do is we monitor the effluent to make sure that we're meeting a total residual chlorine limit that does not result in toxicity in the receiving water. And some plants, we don't need to dechlorinate because of the dynamics of our system. We're such that the chlorine uptake in the final wastewater results in very low chlorine in the discharge. For the plants that we can't do that, we're putting in dechlorination. Now, a CSO treatment facility is very different than a treatment plant because the flow goes from 0 to 800 million gallons per day at a peak, depending on where you're at. So the ability to chlorinate and dechlorinate is very challenging. So brings us to Spring Creek. So Spring Creek is a CSO facility, a storage facility, and over the last year, we've been trying to chlorinate, monitor storms, and look at the operational effectiveness of that chlorination to assess whether we have problems with the residual chlorine in the effluent. I am still looking at the results. I have some of the results in front of me. There were very few storms that we were able to monitor because there was only 5 overflow events in that year, which means, thankfully, the CSO storage tank is doing fabulous because there's very little overflow that's going into the receiving water. But it didn't give us enough data to actually monitor and make some decisions on the best way to chlorinate or dechlorinate. So it's still a continuing struggle. I actually came from a different wastewater utility in a different part of the country where we had chlor and dechlor on CSO control facilities. It's extremely difficult to monitor and to dose and double dose and redose to meet a kind of a steady state standard. So we're still looking at it. It's still not easy. And I'm going to be talking with the state regulatory agency, DEC, to follow up with them on what the best path forward would be for our facilities.
So just on the weight question and the CSO notification, Angela or Bernard, did you want to weigh in on that?
Yeah. Well, with respect to the WAIT program, this is a program that the department had as a pilot in the Newtown Creek area, and what it would do is it would send people push notifications when a storm was coming and asking them to curtail water or particularly wastewater activities. So not waiting to run your dishwasher, waiting to wash your laundry. And it was pretty successful pilot. We were able to actually take some measurements and actually see that those behaviors, in fact, did curtail the amount of water that we were measuring in the pipe and looking at in terms of those users and their households' demand for water and wastewater. So we were encouraged to see that maybe, generally the population does want to be part of the solution and change some of their behaviors. And we're going to take the next phase and kick it up a notch. And we're going to apply that in the Flushing Bay watershed. So stay tuned for that. You'll be hearing a little bit more from us. And then I will turn it over to Pinar, who's been doing a lot of work on CSO notification and CSO modeling for alerts.
Well, there's a lot of notifications going on, but I think the most important for most of us are those that are relevant to the beach advisories and CSO waterbody advisories. So there are 2 different notification systems. You need to sign up separately. However, on the waterbody advisories, which is the CSO notifications, currently the system is using the model developed in 2009 on the open waters model. And a year and a half ago, we collaborated with Stevens Institute of Technology, Nikita, who's leading this NIHOPS modeling, which is a hydrodynamic model that really encompassed the whole New York Harbor all the way to the Long Island Sound and the Raritan Bay and the Hudson River, so on and so forth. So, whenever I go to these public meetings, we've been asked, like, what's going on in Hudson? We never get an advisory, or what about the Harlem River or the Raritan Bay? And one of those reasons, because in the 2000 model, we didn't have every tributary included. So now under the NIHOPS model, we have 68 water bodies included, covering the whole harbor and even more. And we are going to be updating this advisory system with more increased rainfall inches. So it's still going to be based on a regression curve, but the sensitivity is going to be more when picking up the rainfall more than 2 inches up to 4.5 and 5 inches to see if the advisory needs to be issued. So there's a lot going on in that field. I think we, in the past, we have done a nice overview at a HIP meeting with the Stevens Institute, and we've been planning to have another one as soon as we finalize the work. We have our consultants here today to working, improving that waterbody advisory system. But it's almost done, the good news. We are going to update the model, so for those water bodies that you may not have had in the past receiving advisories, there's going to be advisories issued depending on the rainfall. And another layer we are adding is, I think, some people are more visual than just getting an alert saying that there's an advisory. So we are going to couple that with more of a geographic user interface on the web. So if you go to the website, you'll be able to see different colors to see which water bodies are going to be under advisory. So more work is coming, and thank you for your patience so far. If you are signed up, you are still getting an advisory, but I think what I'm trying to say is that system is going to be greatly enhanced in the next couple of months.
And I would just add on to that, from a public engagement standpoint, we know that this is really challenging. So we've had a lot of conversations with Pam's team, because obviously they're reporting things out to the state that the state is then sending out through their NYalert system. But we know that many of our New York City stakeholders aren't aware of the state alert system, or they're more comfortable using New York City alert systems, or getting tweets or so on from Notify NYC. So we've had a lot of conversations with Pam's team with the state to see how we can find some synergies between the two different notification programs to make it easier for the New York City stakeholders. So as Pinar said, those efforts are kind of happening hand in hand. And so we're looking forward to engaging all of you with that as we progress. Yeah. Eric?
Hi, thanks so much. One quick question is, do you have any intention to use ultraviolet LEDs as part of disinfection? Singapore has directed reuse of wastewater, which is a much more ambitious thing than we're looking at. So it uses reverse osmosis before LEDs. But just as, not as a silver bullet, but as part of the solution, is there a possibility of using rings of UV LEDs at stormwater outflow points, or in the tunnels if they're being stored, and then therefore reduce the need for chlorinization? I know there are turbidity issues and things like that, so it's not a 100% solution, but it might at least reduce the need for chlorine. Is that being considered or experimented with?
Well, UV disinfection is out there, and yes, Singapore does have a program that takes their wastewater and actually creates drinking water from it, and it's fantastic. If anybody is on vacation, they happen to go to Asia, go visit it. But it is to be evaluated as we evaluate all technologies. There's a lot of challenges in using it in CSO applications, and I think you hit on turbidity issues. That's one thing, and secondly, without the constant flow, you don't always have flow through the bulbs, and there's just a lot of complications of it. Now, that's setting aside the cost. That's one thing. And the other challenge, and I think this needs to be part of the conversation in everything that we do, is we're trying to meet sustainable goals, energy conservation goals, reduce our greenhouse gas impact, and as we add technologies like UV, which may be appropriate, we still have to include that in the alternatives analysis. So it's a very complicated matrix of comparison and decision making. At this stage, it makes absolutely the most sense to try and use chlorination for the disinfection projects that we have at hand. And it's not particularly best alternative for combined sewer overflow needs. UV at CSOs.
Willis?
Hi, I'd like to ask two questions. That's okay. Thanks, Mikhail. So the first is just about green infrastructure, and it seems that even some of the statements that were said tonight about green infrastructure being a key component of long-term control plan, you're very interested in utilizing it. It seems that that's not actually the case with some of the long-term control plans, that a lot of the focus is on hard gray infrastructure. And as Pam just mentioned, that there's a lot of ulterior costs to some of these issues, and I know that there's a growing interest. There's a lot of green infrastructure practitioners in the audience tonight, building owners, and specifically for some of the CSO sheds that are not getting any attention at all, it seems like that's a really ripe opportunity. So my question is to clarify what GI improvements are happening under these long-term control plans, if any, and then what are other innovative ways that we're thinking about increasing that. The second question is more broad about what the role is between DEP and DEC. And first question, if anybody from DEC is present at the meeting tonight, because it seems like they have such a vital role in all these processes, and that the communication between the community, between the residents of New York and the state who ultimately has control over all this, is not as good as it should be. And just to speak about, you know, some of our own experiences of dealing with something with like aeration, which has tons of community opposition, and at this point it's been a very challenging conversation because that was something that, as you guys will say, is mandated by the state for you to oversee. And we feel like there's not recourse. And so the question is about going forward. A lot of these plans have already been approved. It seems like there hasn't been the opportunity for community members to specifically discuss issues and concerns about whether it's chlorination or lack of CSO capture with the state directly, and what are the ways that we could better facilitate and improve that going forward, because I know there's a lot of, I speak to a lot of local electeds, and they're very unclear about what is the process for public comment, things like these. Jim spoke about, you know, that there's conversations that you're having right now with DEC about plans getting approved, and we're not seeing that back and forth. So where does the community fit into this larger, you know, complicated connection? Thank you.
Okay, so why don't we unpack that a little bit and start with Angela and Pinar on the GI questions.
Yeah, but you raise a really good point. Because we've been working on the Green Infrastructure Program as something that the city initially proposed to do outside of a regulatory scheme, right? And we came up with the Green Infrastructure Plan, and we set a bar at what would happen if we could take 10% of the impervious areas within the CSO watersheds and essentially capture 1 inch of rainfall over that area. So we set up that goal of capturing the 1 inch of rainfall over 10% of the impervious area over the 60% of the city that has combined sewers. And then we started a long-term control planning process. So we're still committed to the goal of reaching that 10%, and we're trying to apportion that to each of the priority water bodies. And frankly, it is a little messy because we had already initiated so much green infrastructure in water bodies where we're still proposing a lot of gray. But we do take into account what would be accomplished with the green infrastructure. So where would we be with the projects that are already underway, because we have made prior commitments for CSO control, as we've discussed all evening. We then layer on the green infrastructure investments and the benefits that we would get from that. And then we look at what additional gray projects we would need on top of that. So it's really been, it's efficient in the sense that we are trying to work from our lowest cost solutions to our highest cost solutions. But I will agree with you, Willis, that in some of those locations where we haven't come up with an efficient gray infrastructure project, or we don't think that that level of investment is warranted, we can circle back and look at what additional things we can do with the green infrastructure. So thanks for that comment.
And I would just add, if you have specific questions about green infrastructure implementation in your watershed, we do have copies of the last Green Infrastructure Annual Report. There is a table that actually shows impervious acres managed, constructed green infrastructure, planned green infrastructure, and so you have the more real-time numbers in that document or on our website. And then in terms of your question about the state and coordination between DEC and DEP, I do want to introduce Linda Allen, who is here on behalf of DEC, and invite her to comment on that.
Yeah, thank you. In general, I want to clarify kind of what the state's view is in terms of when they receive an LTCP from the city. When one of these LTCPs is submitted to the state, it needs to be in an approvable form. And what that means is that the document has to be such that the state can approve it in its current condition with minimal revision. So before the plan is submitted is really the time when the community should be engaging with the city to determine what goes into the plan. Now, at the same time that that is occurring, and I think that has been occurring very well over the past few years as the city has developed its LTCPs, they've had public meetings, they have solicited public input during these meetings from the community into your concerns over their alternatives and your views and in your comments, that they take those into consideration and then they finalize the plan and they submit it to the state. While that is going on, the state is also engaging in discussions with the city purely on a technical, I think, level. And we're well aware of the concerns that are being raised by the community as well. But the key thing is that the discussion really needs to be occurring directly between the community and the city on these plans. Once they get finalized and submitted to the state, basically that's the final document. It's not going to be subject to further discussion with the community. The state expects the plan to be ready to be approved or nearly ready to be approved when it is submitted by the milestone. And so I think there's been a lot of confusion about when the plan is submitted to the state, that the public then has an opportunity to provide comments to the state on it. And that's really not what the way the process is intended to be. So I hope that clarified, kind of the state's role in working with the city on development of these plans and where the community fits in. The community really should be communicating with the city before the plan is submitted to the state.
I just think the issue is that you're setting yourself up for many decades of continued tension between the city and the communities. Where I use the example of aeration, but all these communities in Alley Creek and Flushing, they are not going to be satisfied with the disinfection and having 1 billion gallons of untreated sewage going into Flushing Creek every year. So what is the recourse for that? You're saying it's already a done deal, and it was a done deal back in March. So, how do we move beyond that so that we can actually find solutions that appease all interested parties that have to deal with the consequences of these decisions? It seems ridiculous that there's no way for there to be any sort of assessment of plans that have been submitted and approved. That's all I don't know, that's all I have to say about it. I think it's a bad process. It's been set up, and there should be ways to have checks and balances and feedback as things develop, because it's just the way it goes.
So I do want to give an opportunity to someone who hasn't asked a question yet. So, Chrissy?
So I have a specific question about the disinfection, if we can return to that in Flushing Creek. I was just wondering, you mentioned that you're having trouble proving the efficacy. And you also mentioned that you're back in discussions with DEC. So within the context of those discussions, are you bringing back to the table some of the earlier options that you had made within the long-term control plan that involved capture? Again, particularly in one of the largest CSOs in the city.
Right, so your question is, are we revisiting alternatives that were explored prior? Is that your question?
Yeah, just because you're having trouble proving the efficacy of the option that we had originally chose.
Right, so we have not gone back to actively look at other alternatives. Pam, I think she's reflecting on your comment. Yeah. I don't know if that's what you meant, but we're not actively looking at other alternatives. Go ahead.
I just want to expand on the question. So you're asking about Flushing Bay or Flushing Creek?
Flushing Creek.
Flushing Creek.
Where there's planned in-pipe disinfection.
Right. So in Flushing Creek, as Jim mentioned, we spent, what was the number? $400 million?
$400 million almost.
$400 million to build a 40 million gallon storage tank. So the storage tank is there already, but maybe once every couple of months, there's a storm of sufficient size that it exceeds the capacity of the tank, and the tank does overflow into the creek. So the concept is to disinfect whenever that tank overflows.
Sure, yeah, I understand that.
Yeah.
Thank you. But yeah, there are still billions of gallons.
Right, so what I guess you're proposing is that we build another tank. No, what are you proposing? That's what I'm not sure.
there were other, I believe within the context of the long-term control plan, there were other.
Chrissy, can you turn on your microphone, please? Because I think that other stuff is on.
There were other options as well for capture within the context of the creek.
We did look at storage. It is incredibly expensive, but it's something, actually, we looked at synergies between the Flushing Bay tunnel and maybe extending that tunnel to Flushing Creek, but it came at the cost of $300 or $400 million more for that. So again, it was determined that disinfection seemed to be the most cost-effective way to deal with that, with the dechlorination. So that's the main point, is that dechlor. The operational issues that Pam mentioned before, I think we're still working through in terms of how that'll be done. I don't know if you want to say more about that or not, but it's just something we're still piloting at Spring Creek. When folks are saying billions of gallons going untreated, I believe our target during the rec season is to treat 90 to 95% of the CSO flow. So I'm not sure where that billion gallons of untreated comes from, but we're treating 2 locations, overflows from the tank, so it's already getting storage, doesn't overflow every time. And then there's another outfall that we're treating there, and I believe our target is 90 to 95% of the CSO would be treated. So that's what we're looking at, but for chlor and then dechlorination. So not trying to put that chlorination out into the water body, but trying to control that. I think the points Pam is making on operations, we're still working through in terms of that, how we make it work. And I guess Seattle is making it work. No, Seattle's not making it work, so yeah, please elaborate.
It's just really a challenge. And the reason why we chlorinate is to have less bacteria, is to eliminate the risk for bacteria. And that is an important component, right? And then our target is not to cause chlorine toxicity. It's really challenging in the CSO context to do that. And Flushing Creek, a CSO storage facility, I don't know the volume offhand. Yeah, it is capturing a ton of wastewater that is being treated at the treatment plant right now. So there will be overflow events. And so for those events, we have to look at what's the best way to manage it. And we have choices. We could not chlorinate and let the bacteria be the issue, or we can chlorinate and try and control the chlorine levels. And that is the challenge we have to deal with at the CSO control facility. So with the context of how we're going to do that, and then we have limited data points to date on how to manage that within one facility, there's a lot of thought, conversations, modeling, even maybe some bench scale tests. But with the variability of flow volume, quality, the first flush of a storm is always different than the later storm. If it hasn't rained for 2 days, the water coming in is going to be different than if it just rained yesterday or last week. So there's just a wide variety of issues we have to deal with and try to address in the context of operating those type of facilities.
And I think, to going back to the question, I mean, we would all love to capture every last drop of CSO, convey it to a wastewater treatment plant where it can be disinfected there. But, I think Jim pointed out on this graph is just rainfall. And it's, up to a certain point, we can build storage tanks, storage tunnels, green infrastructure to capture or reduce those CSOs. But you get to a point where there's going to be these big storms, 3, 4, 5-year, 10-year storms where you'd have to build enormous amounts of storage that is just unsightable and in New York City. And that's where it gets tough. So we're trying to look at other alternatives, including disinfection of some of those overflows during really the biggest storms as an alternative.
And just to add to that, if you go to slide 43 if you can, but again, it shows the cost. And again, this is just this doesn't include the open waters in Jamaica Bay, which is probably a larger volume, but you approach it when you start looking at 100% control, $30 billion additional to the DP budget. And again, if you hit the open waters in Jamaica Bay, that's over $100 billion. So the costs are hard to get. And in terms of disinfection, 200 to 300 communities throughout the United States use chlorine and disinfection for CSO. So it is widely practiced. It's in the EPA manual. And probably 80 to 90% dechlor, but some don't even dechlor right now. But it's widely practiced chlorine disinfection on CSOs.
So I do want to move to another question. Larry?
Thanks, Mikhail. Thank you all for presentations and all of you being here to answer questions and talk to everybody, and for all the effort that you guys put into all this for many decades. A couple things. I won't use this word lightly, but I'm going to use it. It seems to me disingenuous the way you guys talk about disinfection. Chlorine and disinfection are used as part of a sewage treatment process and as part of a combined sewer overflow management process in many places. From all the conversations I've had with folks from DEP or from EPA or from anywhere else that I can find, the kind of disinfection you're talking about here is not done anywhere else. And if I'm wrong, please correct me. I'd like to understand it better. That doing in-pipe disinfection is different than in a controlled setting, being able to temporarily hold on to that overflow, treat it, dose it, and then release it, and which is the sort of thing that my understanding, and again, I'd like to understand better if I'm missing it. My understanding that's the way it's done elsewhere when we talk about EPA's manuals of the different types of CSO methods. It's a different sort of a thing they're talking about. It seems to be mixing apples and oranges when we use the word chlorination and lump everything together under that. So I guess it looks like if you want to reply like that, you want to add a different point also.
It is the exact same chlorination used around the country. We're looking typically for 15-minute detention time. Everywhere we go, we use the pipe. It happened to have TI-11 happened to have a pipe that had 15-minute detention time, perfect for disinfection. So that's why that was such a cost-effective alternative in Flushing Creek. So we had the tank at TI-10, 15-minute or more detention time. We had a long effluent conduit at TI-11 where we'd put a flow control structure again, get a 15-minute detention time, declaw prior to discharge. It's what's practiced around the country. It's almost identical. So it's not any different.
That's something that would be useful to have some more information on, because I think there's conflicting information from what we've seen on it. But
Sure, we can put that together. Sure.
Good to follow up. The other question I want to raise is what seems to be missing. Well, two things seem to be missing from the conversation and the way the kind of big picture is presented. The frequency of the overflows that we're talking about now and with these plans in place, right? It's not simply the case from looking at DEP's own plans that it's going to be the infrequent large storms that are going to continue to have overflows. If you look at the Flushing Creek LTCP, for example, it's 14 times a year there's going to be an overflow that tank doesn't hold. And it adds up to 1.2 billion gallons per year. And some of that gets the disinfection, which may or may not work under the plan. Right? So we're not talking about the occasional storm. Bronx River, we're talking about 31 overflows per year remaining after implementation of the plan that DEP submitted and DEC approved. We're talking about right now is the alert system is tripping 100 times a year. There's an email going out telling people there's been an overflow somewhere in the city. And that's without counting any overflows that are happening in the East River or the Harlem River or the Hudson River that the system isn't yet accounting for. We're very glad to hear it's going to be up there. Right? So the characterization of what the problem is that we're dealing with, I think there are a lot of different ways to characterize it. And one that really has an impact on people where they interact with the water is, when is this happening? How often is this happening? And that's the frequency question. And it doesn't really come up in these presentations, and those numbers are really extremely large, despite some of the other numbers that get put up. And the other piece of context I just wanted to put out is looking at the historic sweep of this. Yes, going back to 1980, 110 billion gallons, something like that, before you had the sewage treatment plants. And then the line comes all the way down pretty sharply because you built the sewage treatment plants. Right? You get to that point and you've got around 32 billion gallons or so of wet weather overflow after the treatment plants are in place, and that's by the early 90s. If you're looking at 32 billion gallons in the early 90s, and you're looking at the year 2035, at the end of these plants, we're going to have 18 billion gallons. That's in 43 years, we've reduced it only by half, and we still have 18 billion gallons left. That's, putting it in that context, it just seems pretty extraordinary for the city to say that that's enough.
So I'll touch on a couple of things. First, the 110 billion gallons. So the last two treatment plants of the 14 went into service in the mid-1980s. It was the North River plant, which was treating at the time 170 million gallons a day, and the Red Hook plant, which was treating about 40 million gallons a day. So before that, those plants went online, 210 million gallons a day of raw sewage, dry weather, was being released into local waterways. and 110 million gallons of wet weather, because a lot of our plants weren't meeting the requirements to pump and treat 2 times design dry weather flow through primary treatment and disinfection. So we have actually brought wet weather flows down from 110 million to 20 by doing all of these great work. The other thing is just on the releases. So you mentioned, Larry, we send out these blurbs essentially every time it rains, and it's because we really don't have a good way of determining when a regulator, and there's over 400 of these regulators around the system, when they release. We just don't have good telemetry. New York City is a tidal city. There's water sloshing back and forth. So we can't tell. So just to be on the conservative side, essentially every time there's more than 1/10 of an inch per hour, we're sending out a blur. There may have been, we had rain the other day. We looked at our wastewater treatment plants. None of them got to 2 times flow. Weren't sure if there even was a CSO event, but we put out the alert just to be proactive. The thing that we're looking at in our long-term control plans are these big outfalls. And I mentioned there's over 400 regulators in the city. 15 of them represent 50% of the CSO flow. So those are the ones we're targeting. We want to get the big ones. And we already have, Jim talked about Pawtucket Basin and Flushing Creek. You want to spend the money in the right places to get the most amount of reduction in CSOs for the lowest amount of dollars. And that's where we are. If you want to, again, we all agree CSOs are not a good thing, and we want to get to as close to zero as we can. But if you want to get to zero, that green line on dollars spent, as Keith said, you could spend $100 billion to get to zero. That's going to take a long time for us to find that much money to do it.
So I think we have time for 2 more questions. Yes, the Miss in the pink.
In previous meetings, both Jim and Keith had said that when you're doing the environmental studies for the disinfection, it's all done by engineers, there are no biologists.
No.
You did say that.
I don't think I said that. Go ahead.
Maybe about 2 years ago, yeah.
Yeah, I'm not exactly sure, but I trust that you do recall hearing something like that. But just rest assured that when we do these big projects, we subject them to the rules and regulations of the city's Environmental Quality Review Act. And so as part of that process, Panara mentioned that she has a team of specialists that work in their interdisciplinary team. So they're studying those projects and looking at the potential for impacts on ecology. They're looking at air, noise, traffic. So we go through a full spectrum of environmental issues, and we bring in whatever expertise that we lack within the department through outside consultants, and we scrutinize these projects very thoroughly.
And they've said that there's nothing going to happen to the wildlife.
We haven't done that yet. So those,
are you
the
still
analysis,
gonna do it?
we are, that's right. The way the process works is first we generate the project, and then as we start to develop design information, because we need a little information to work back and forth on the environmental impacts. So we want to get to like a 30% design so that we have true understanding of the project that we're proposing. We have the sites located and all that information that will then get fed into the environmental review process. So, we need to be more patient for that process to at this point in time, we don't see designs for some of these projects for another couple of years, but we will, I assure you, we will be going through a very thorough examination.
Right, and just to add to that, all the water quality criteria, EPA establishes it based on all chemists, biologists. They have the gold book, so they'll have a limit for chlorine based on most sensitive species. Some species take 3-4 milligrams per liter. They go for the most sensitive, eastern oyster larvae for chlorine. They look at unionized ammonia. They look at cyanide. The EPA developed all these criteria. The state then takes that criteria, back calculates a water quality-based effluent limit that applies to the plant. If we want to then look at that limit, see if it's really appropriate, we'll then bring in biologists. Like we're working with Great Lakes Environmental Center, who does all these studies to look at certain things. We did some studies at 26 Ward. to see if there's any impact from Hendricks Creek, the ecology, to the marshland. So, but all these things are based, the basis of all our limits at the treatment plant, everything we're doing is the water quality criteria and the species, how they react to the chemicals. So that's the basis for all these programs.
So has it been done or has it not?
It's been done for 30, 40 years. There's tons of data out there on chlorine toxicity, on everything. And we went further. There's things, a water effect ratio, because not every water body is the same. So you can say, well, this species doesn't exist there, or it may react differently. So it's been done for years. And we can, yeah, if we had to deviate from an EPA set criteria or a DEC standard, we'd have to do some sort of water effect ratio. We'd have to demonstrate no adverse impacts to the ecology.
You're still going to do a study? Because you're just saying different things.
Sorry, so I do want to, I'll just clarify and then we'll take the next question. So what Angela was saying is correct, that these environmental assessments will take place for all of these projects that we're talking about, for the specific project. But that can't happen until the design begins, because you have to know what the design of the project will be in order to assess it and look at the environmental impacts. What Keith is talking about is what's already occurred because of our wastewater treatment plant process. So we're talking about two different types of things. So I do want to take one more question. Well, both of you have asked questions before. So I'm going to, yeah, how do I do this? We'll end with Lewis.
I want to circle back a little bit to the cost of homeowners and sewer rates, etc. At a certain point, if the costs get beyond the ability of the average person to pay, you're going to run into a great deal of problem of acceptance for future work. So I see that the prices have gone up for sewers considerably. You got projections for the next 10 years with everything that's going on?
So, yeah, and every year when we have to do rate setting, we hear it loud and clear from the homeowners, and, we try to strike that balance about what, we consider necessary work and what's affordable. But and by the way, we should mention, to do these projects, we fund them by issuing bonds. The Municipal Water Finance Authority issues bonds on the open market. I think you heard from Angela that we've been seeing very low interest rates over the last few years. We don't know if that's going to last. We're hearing now that the Trump administration may get rid of the tax exemption on municipal bonds. That may raise prices too. So take all these things into consideration. But you're right. We have to be very careful about how much we raise rates to fund this, and we think we're striking the right balance now. Just going forward, when we do bond offerings, we have to do a 4-year projection of what the rates are going to be. And so we have that in our prospectuses. The projections, and I'll just let you know what they are now for the next fiscal year coming up, rate setting in May, it's about 2.1%. It then ramps up to a little over 4% when we're 4 years out. So that's where we are, a little bit higher than inflation.
So I just want to remind you, if your question didn't get answered tonight, please write it down, leave it at our back table, and when we have the response to comments, we'll answer all of that.
Me?
Yes.
Great. So I'm Michael Deloach. I just recently joined DEP. And I know some familiar faces from my time at City Hall for the past few years working on some key initiatives and priorities, so it's nice to see you. And I've already gotten to meet a couple of you through my work at DEP in the past couple of months, so I look forward to expanding on that work. I am very lucky to have joined DEP. It is obviously a very impressive agency with some very dedicated, talented, largely engineers that are doing great things for the city. But it came up tonight, and there's a lot of opportunity. Obviously, this is also a very passionate and sophisticated group. But there are plenty of people across the city who don't understand even the basics of where we get water, or how we do our projects and how we do our priorities. So I have a unique job of overseeing the public affairs unit, which does. We have our outreach team, we have comms, we have press team, we have an education team. Basically everything external sort of goes through our shop. So it is a lot. And in addition to the long-term control plans and the MSFORs and the CSOs and the green infrastructure, there's water main breaks, and there's all kinds of other fun that we deal with. So we're kept pretty busy. But I look forward to working with you as we move forward. So, which button is it? So on green infrastructure, just to quickly, when I first got to green infrastructure, there was, it was referenced earlier in Queens, a lot of people that were unhappy, a lot of predominantly single-family homeowners who were unhappy with our green infrastructure program. And so we've taken some initiative and done some changes to help better educate and help better clarify what we are doing and what we're not doing. So we have new brochures that are hopefully a little bit clearer and more concise. They're in different languages to better communicate to a wider swath of New Yorkers. We are going out actively to civic associations and community boards, doing conference calls with elected officials and their constituents on details. People were getting green spray paint and drilling happening, and they didn't really know what was happening or what was going on. So we're having liaisons give out information and give out pamphlets to better clarify the process. We have a new hotline. We have 311 better equipped to handle complaints about trash in their rain gardens. So we're doing a lot to help better identify the rain gardens and get people clear on what we're trying to do. Related to the long-term control plan, in terms of the public participation, there's a lot of new things on our website. We encourage people to take the fact sheets for each of the different water bodies tonight. There's YouTube videos, a lot of them, and all moving forward will be on YouTube. We have the response to comments that we have that have been approved, and obviously the DEC approval letter. So I don't think this was done before, and so we want to make sure to be as transparent moving forward. There's also just today uploaded on our website the long-term control plan brochure that has descriptions and overviews of all submitted and approved LTCPs. We talked a little, Willis, you talked a little bit about the sort of feedback of our plans before or after they go to the state DEC. I jumped ahead, but I'm just going to go to that. So we are in talks with DEC right now to ask for an extension on both the Jamaica Bay and the East River Open Waters long-term control plans that are yet to be submitted, to give ourselves a longer window to get information to you. We'll submit a final draft long-term control plan to the public for review, and then have public meetings where we can talk about why we're doing what we're doing, allow for public comment period for the public to ask questions, and for us to be able to respond and potentially make changes to our final submittal to the state. I think it is largely, from what we heard tonight and what we've heard throughout this process, giving the public an ability to better comment, at least to the city, before we submit our approvable plan to the DEC. So we're still talking with them about exactly how that will work, but if you hear that we are asking for an extension, it is because we're trying to allow for more public engagement. And so we want to just make sure that that is clear. So there'll be kickoff meetings for some of the plans in January, and they'll go through October, November of next year, depending on the different plans. But we have gone out of our way to try and do good work with communicating exactly how this all works. We have Mikkel, who is amazing and has done a great job helping us prepare for all of this. We're hoping to have simpler meetings with the Eventbrite. We're still tinkering with RSVPs. We obviously didn't have a full house, but we had a sold-out event, so we're playing with that. Improving presentations, trying to make things as easy to understand as possible. Video footage. Apparently other groups are videoing as well, so that's great. And just trying to really simplify and clear and concise all public materials for LTCPs or for anything moving forward. So I was a little bit more nervous than I thought I was going to be, but I will be a better communicator in my job with other staff helping to communicate, I guess. But we really look forward to working with everybody to, there's such, like I said, there's such good stuff happening. A lot of it is complex and all of it is not without controversy, but I think what we're going to try and do in my shop is just better engage folks, meet with folks, have a better back and forth, and for those that aren't necessarily coming to these type of events, to try and communicate out to a larger audience about all the good stuff we're doing, and continue to have the best water that we can. So with that said, I think we're all done, and I think we'll all be here to answer questions, and we appreciate you coming out. Look forward to working with everybody moving forward. Thanks very much.